Lord, and we're talking about the nature of God as the end focus of our study. But before we get to that, we've been looking at positive arguments, not negative. Sometimes when you get into a discussion of Christian evidences, you spend a lot of time disproving evolution, which is really not that difficult. And the atheistic position. But we're not looking at that. Really, we're looking at positive arguments for the existence of God, and certainly not just the existence of a God, but of the God of the Bible. And so we've been looking at several of the classical arguments. We looked first at the intuitional argument, that is the idea that belief in God or a supernatural, a higher power, is natural to mankind. If you leave a child alone, generally he'll grow up believing that unless he's taught to believe otherwise. And even atheists have done studies on that and will admit to that. And then we looked at the cosmological argument. Comes from the word cosmos. That's the universe, and it's here. I mean, the fact that it is, how do you explain that? I mean, if there was nothing, if there was always nothing before it was here, then there would still be nothing. That's simple Jethro Bodine math right there. Naught times naught equals naught. So we talked about the cosmological argument. We then looked at the moral argument. That is, and we saw, an atheist will admit, that only morals arise in man. Animals don't engage in morality. And certainly there's this issue or question of how could morals arise in us when we supposedly, first of all, life sprang, they say, from non-life, which of course violates the law of biogenesis, violates a well-established scientific law. And then, after all these random processes and chances, we sprang from animal ancestors. So again, how do you explain morality? How do you explain that man has a sense of oughtness? I ought to do this and ought not do that. Or the fact that in all cultures, there are just certain things that everybody agrees, absolutely, this is wrong. That's right, this is wrong. It's not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of, well, that's okay for you and it's not for me. If we want to murder in this culture, that's fine. If we want to rape in this culture, that's fine. Nobody agrees with that. And so, again, where do the morals arise or come from if there's no absolute standard? If atheism and evolution are true, there can't be an absolute standard. It is silly to talk in terms of good and evil, right and wrong. It's just whatever works for you. And it's survival of the fittest, so whatever, however you want to survive and get by, you do whatever you want to. So today, and probably for a couple of weeks, we're going to look at the teleological argument. Teleological argument. The Bible, God, who is infinite in nature, has revealed Himself in two ways, two major forms of revelation. What we might call natural or generic, and what we might call supernatural or special. Now, special revelation consists of what? Special, supernatural revelation is what? Not a trick question. This is easy. Huh? The Bible. Yeah, God has revealed Himself supernaturally, specially through His divine inspired book, the Bible. That's called special revelation. He miraculously directed human writers to record His will. Now, He may have allowed them to use their own personalities and use of language and all that kind of thing, but the bottom line is, the Bible says, He inspired them. He miraculously gave them His Word, and they've recorded it for us. Natural revelation consists, obviously, of what? Natural. Cut the last letter off of that. Nature, the material realm. Okay? God created the heavens and the earth. Therefore, if God created the heavens and the earth, you would think that you're going to see His fingerprints all over it. Right? So, and if you're unbiased, and honest. That's what you'll see. And why is it that generally people, why do atheists go to so much trouble? We've talked about this before, but why do they go to so much trouble not to believe?
Because it ranges on the just and the unjust.
Well, that's not why they go to the trouble not to believe, though. Why is it they don't want to believe? They want to do what they want to do. They don't want any constructs. They don't want any constraints on their behavior. They want to be able to live the way they want to live, and if there's a God in heaven to whom they must answer, they can't live that way, or if they do, they feel bad about it. They have what we call guilt. And they don't like it. They want to be able to fulfill their own fleshly appetites and desires, and they don't have to be concerned about whether that's in harmony with God's will or not. So, the word teleology comes from the Greek term Telos. You probably know that term from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, right? Talking about the Bible, God's Word. He said, Paul said by the Spirit, these things are going to pass away, right, when that which is perfect is come. That which is complete. Teleos is the Greek word there. Perfect, complete. That comes from a word telos, which means end, outcome, or result. And so the teleological argument maintains that we have proof for the existence of God in that the universe exhibits what? It's not just the fact. The cosmological argument says, well, it's here. That's the law of cause and effect. Every material effect must have an adequate cause, right? And you can't have an adequate, it has to be mine because the material can't create itself. So that's the cosmological argument. It's here. What cause, why is it here? But the teleological argument goes beyond that. It says, okay, the universe is here, and when we look at it, it exhibits what? Design, purpose, intention. Okay? And so that's the teleological order. Design and order. And the characteristics of design indicate, if you see something that has characteristics of design, then you come to the logical conclusion that there had to be what? A design. Right. Anytime you see something that has been designed, you say, hey, it has a design. And so again, we can go back to the same verse, Hebrews 3:4, right? Every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. Well, we use that verse for the cosmological argument because, it's here. But we can go even further. That verse even points to the teleological argument in that, all right, let's talk about houses. Do houses exhibit design? Absolutely. In fact, you would, I'm sure, insult the architect if you told him that that house didn't exhibit any design. In fact, architects are one of those professions in our society that deals specifically with design. The other major category of designers in our society is clothing designers. I'm not really concerned. I'm talking about the people that make things work, make things go. Huh? Engineers. So, if I see a watch, I look at this watch. If I were to open that up, I'd say, man, that's pretty complex. So the atheist sees a watch and he says, man, that's complex. He looks at the systematic chronometers of the universe and says, what? That's not design? I mean, let's think about this past summer. This universe runs with such precision that we were told for weeks and months on end that on this certain date you need to be, if you're anywhere in Tennessee, you need to drive to Nashville because that's where you're going to see what? A complete full eclipse, not just a partial. You can hang around here and see a partial one if you want, but this thing, they told us all along, you could see a map of the United States and it was going to take this path. It was going to go right through middle Tennessee and down across Georgia and on, keep on going. Well, how can they do that? How can they do that? Because our universe runs with such mathematical precision. Order, design. I mean, think about a car. A car is a pretty complex piece of machinery.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
While this is mundane, well, just think about our ecosystem. And I always think about, because I came to north central Florida, and I can remember as a boy that because my community was a farming community, the tomatoes, the cucumbers, et cetera, watermelon, so on and so forth. So I can remember down in Immokalee, Florida, a certain time of the year, they would be down there to begin the harvest of the same fruits that we were going to harvest up in north central Florida. And in those days, African Americans tended to follow those seasons that they referred to. So I've often thought, suppose all of the string beans around the world came in at the same time. We of all people would be most miserable.
Yeah. You'd be in trouble, wouldn't you?
Huh?
You'd be in trouble.
We'd be in trouble. It's by order.
And here's the thing with the teleological argument, and we're going to talk about some things, but we could sit here and we could discuss example after example after example of design in our physical universe. And we could do that for the next 50 years, frankly, every Sunday morning, and not anywhere get close to exhausting what men know. And that doesn't even speak to what God knows and we don't about how this universe operates. But that's a good point. I mean, you're talking about, and you mentioned fruits and vegetables and botany. You know, I read somewhere that even as complex as a car is, that's pretty crude compared to the inner workings of a tree leaf. Okay? And how it operates and lives. So you take a car, which we know is designed, and how did it get designed? It was designed by who? Men using their what? Specifically using their, as we used to say, your noggin. You know, your parents would say, why don't you use your noggin? Your brain. Right. So men's brains, these engineers and these architects, they design all this wondrous stuff that we enjoy in the most technologically advanced part of mankind's history. And yet, the atheist will say that man's brain, the brain that's created all this stuff, designed all this stuff, and is nowhere near as complex as the brain itself, somehow came about accidentally, haphazardly, randomly. It makes no sense whatsoever when you think about our brain. Well, just that's by way of introduction. I know there's a lot of things, as you pointed out, Brother Rufus, that we can talk about when it comes to examples. And I may throw out, we're going to look at a few toward the end, just some that I find really bizarre and interesting. Not just the normal. But I want to look at this from another angle. I want to look at 5 areas in which scientists, and usually when I use the word scientist, I'm talking about what kind of science? I mean, as a general rule, the vast percentage of scientists are wrong. Yeah, they're atheists or evolutionists. Not all, but the majority. 5 ways in which they openly acknowledge design in nature. Now, number 1 is, I don't know if y'all keep up with this or not, but what's the latest, what over the past couple of decades is the explanation for the beginning of the universe? Yeah, Big Bang. But as you know, they always get hit with, well, where did the stuff come from? And so they have to deal with that. And what the problem is that they get back to the point, I think it's Stephen, y'all know who Stephen Hawking is, the guy in the wheelchair that's supposed to be so smart, but I mean, just because you're in a wheelchair doesn't make you smart. I'm sorry. Okay? You can be smart or dumb whether you're in a wheelchair or not. And it doesn't matter to me whether you've been a POW in Vietnam, it doesn't make you a good U.S. citizen. Okay?
You don't get a pass, okay? Now, the problem they have is if there was nothing before, they'll say, well, there was laws. They sometimes talk about quantum fluctuation, things like that. There was a quantum fluctuation that caused. Well, and then every time they say something like that, another scientist comes back and says, well, no, wait a minute. Okay? If there was a fluctuation, there had to be quantum laws to do the fluctuating. So regardless of whether you say there was nothing there, they'll come back and say, well, as long as there was a law there, this could happen. The question, of course, ultimately then becomes, and this is where atheists have a problem, is where did the laws come from? Where did the laws that operate the universe come from? Assuming that you have, you see, that's not nothing, that's something. So don't ever get by with that. Well, there was nothing material, there was laws. No, that is something, okay? And so, for instance, they'll talk about, well, we all know if you've got laws, if the state of Tennessee has laws, what do we have to have? We have to have lawmakers, that's right. If the United States has laws, we got lawmakers. If the universe has laws, you had to have a lawgiver, and that's one question they can't get around. They keep trying. You may have heard of Paul Davies from Arizona State. He's another pretty famous atheist. And he talks about this problem. And he asks the question, how did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? You know, why do they act the way they act? Why do they react the way they act? And here's the thing that atheists will all admit. What is it that makes a scientific law a law? Why is it called a law?
It's been proven over and over.
Because it's unbreakable. It always applies. There's no exception. When they talk about the law, first and second laws of thermodynamics, or they talk about the law of biogenesis, or you talk about the law of gravity, they call those things laws because we have found no known exceptions. They operate universally everywhere. Okay? So, you can talk about vacuums, and you can talk about quantum fluctuation, and you can talk about all this stuff, but the problem is, where did the prior existence of these laws of physics come from? So, now what are they talking about these days to try to get around that? Anybody know? How are we going to get around that problem? And it doesn't really get around it, but how do they try to get around it? Yeah, close, and we'll talk about that. That's one thing. But they talk about, well, we're not the only universe. We're part of a what? What do they call it?
Multiverse.
Multiverse. We're part of a multiverse. There's a gazillion universes out there. And therefore, you know, these laws in our universe just came from somewhere else. Again, what's the problem? You ever play, when you were a kid, you ever play a game called Kick the Can? What do we sometimes say when somebody tries to answer a question and it doesn't answer it, it just does what? Kicks the can down the road. This is what inevitably they do every time they try to answer something. Well, it's because, you know, there's this multiverse. Well, the problem is the multiverse has to have laws, right? What are you going to do about that? So again, that's one area that they have a tough time dealing with, and that is when it comes to design, they have to admit, this universe is run by laws, and we don't know where they came from. Well, we know that laws come from lawgivers. It was Hawking that said, quote, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Oh, really? So some other scientists piped in and said, well, where did the law of gravity come from? You're still not answering the question. How did it exist in the first place? What was the creative force behind it? That's what some of the writers, atheistic writers, talked about. You're talking about gravity, but you're not telling us where it came from. So whether they will admit it or not, that's one area of the design teleological argument that they can't deal with. Where did the basic laws of the universe come from? Lawgiver, obviously, but they won't admit it. Now, talking about aliens. Second area they have a problem with is where did life come from, of course. When you look at life in general, you see what? Design, right? And when they look at life, they say, well, we don't know where it came from. And so now, as Warren has pointed out, you hear them talking about, well, it must have come from aliens. That's why they're so desperate to find evidence of life somewhere else in the universe. I've got something here. Let me read this to you. You get a kick out of this. It was several years ago, some astronomers from 30 research institutions in 15 countries, they got together to select a site for a giant telescope that would read TV or radio signals from alien civilizations. It was going to cost $1 billion. $1 billion. The Square Kilometer Array, or SKA, would be the world's most powerful radio telescope. So one of the guys that was in charge of that was speaking at a conference, and he admitted, actually several of them admitted, that, quote, such a search, talking about this direct or indirect evidence of life elsewhere in the universe, would have certain limitations. Well, what are those? And he said, one, we're not sure, I mean, think about it. What would be the limitation? If you got this radio telescope and you're looking for evidence from life coming in from around the universe, what's going to be your number one problem? As this stuff, signals come in. Huh? Well, you're trying to figure out, was that from intelligent life or not? I mean, it could just be noise, just regular celestial noise from the universe. And so that's what this guy said. He said, well, we're not really sure how to recognize these signals if they do come in. And then he said this, the hope is that the signals would consist of organized patterns suggestive of intelligence. Let's think about that. They're going to know if there's aliens out there and life in outer space, if organized patterns suggestive of intelligence come in. So rather than admit there's a God that's responsible for intelligent life on earth, they're going to continue to believe that all of this sprung from non-purposive, unconscious, non-intelligent matter, but we'll squander $1 billion on a telescope to find aliens. And we're only going to know that if they're intelligent. And so if it evidences design. In other words, if the signals have some design and order to them, then we'll know it's intelligent. You see the silliness? And so, they look for aliens. But again, even if you found, well, first of all, by saying we're looking for aliens, they've admitted what? What law did I just mention? What law did I just mention a while ago? If they're looking for aliens as the reason for our existence, then they're admitting what law? Law of biogenesis. Life comes only from what? Life. Life doesn't come from non-life. It doesn't come from dead matter. Life comes only from life and after its kind. So if you're an atheist and you say, well, I'm looking for aliens because aliens must have put us here, you've admitted that the law, you still can't get around the law of biogenesis. Life only comes from life. You're still admitting that there has to be a creator. Well, we're just going to say it was the aliens. But then once again, you've done what? As we said a while ago. What have you done? I mean, remember Hawking said that these laws in the universe are universal. They apply to everybody. So that means if they apply to us, they apply to who? The aliens. Right? So, then all we do is we say, we kick the can down the road, and now we're asking what question? If we find an alien, which we're not going to find. Where did the aliens come from? We're still right back where we were. Right? We've admitted, if we're looking for aliens, that life only comes from life, that we've still found no exception to the law of biogenesis. And number two, somebody had to put the aliens there. They came from somewhere. We've just shifted the argument to outer space somewhere. So, you start talking about intelligence and aliens, you're really tacitly, they won't come out and say it, but you're tacitly admitting the law of the teleological argument, and that it's a valid and sound argument. And number two, you're admitting the law of biogenesis. It's silly. Here's a third area in which they make admissions that they won't necessarily come out to say while they're looking for this multiverse. Because keep in mind, there's no evidence for a multiverse, and they'll admit that it arose from their imagination because they really don't want to admit God. So they've got to find a way to explain all this design. The principle that we talk about, the anthropic principle, made its debut in 1973, and I think that's what Brother Washington was alluding to. But basically, the anthropic principle is the idea that the universe was made for what? What is that anthropic principle? No. That the universe was made just for us. There's so many bizarre coincidences for life to exist just on this planet alone and nowhere else. And we have this principle, and how do you explain it? How do you explain it? Now, we've talked about some of this stuff before. We've talked about, you know, the Earth and how scientists will even call it a fine-tuned piece of machinery, and the way, you know, we revolve around the sun at a certain degree and so many, so many miles away. All this stuff seems to be just perfectly designed, if you will, to make life possible. And they haven't been able to find these conditions anywhere else. Custom tailored is one of the phrases they use to favor the emergence of life. Well, if you're going to have something that's fine-tuned, you got to have what? If something's fine-tuned, you got to have what? You got to have a fine-tuner, right? If my piano is going to be tuned, I got to have a tuner. It used to be that you used to tune cars, right? I don't guess you do that anymore. But if you wanted to tune up, you went to a mechanic. Well, if a universe exhibits the quality of being fine-tuned, custom-made, well, has anybody got anything that's custom-made? This didn't happen by itself, did it? If you got a custom-made suit, you went to a tailor, right? There's a lot of things you can get, quote, custom-made. And so atheists and scientists keep asking themselves this question: why is this earth on which we live, why is this so well suited for life? Well, they have a problem with it. It's just fit perfectly for intelligent life. Well, we know it's because of a powerful, benevolent deity. But they can't admit that. And so they resort to the multiverse and aliens and all kinds of... You know, and the thing is, they make fun of us for being, what? Superstitious ignoramuses?
Dogmatic.
Huh?
Dogmatic.
Yeah. But because they can't admit what's right in front of them, they'll make up stuff they can't prove. This next area in which atheists tacitly admit design, I think it's pretty intriguing. But this is a growing area of scientific study, and it's called biomimicry or biomimicry. Danny probably knows a little bit about that in the engineering field. But engineers are becoming more and more aware that the way things are made in the natural realm is the best design. So what are they doing in some of the things that they're designing? They're trying to mimic or copy nature as much as possible because they haven't been able to improve on the design. Sometimes when you talk about the teleological argument, you know, you'll talk about the human eye and you compare it to the best cameras in the world. Well, you know, cameras and that technology is based upon the human eye, but it's nowhere close to the level of design and what the human eye can do. And so engineers, there's a web page for George Washington University's Center for Biomimetrics and Bio-Inspired Engineering, and it says, quote, this is from their website, Despite our seeming prowess in these component technologies, we find it, quote, we find it hard to outperform nature in this arena. Nature's solutions are smarter, more energy efficient, agile, adaptable, fault tolerant, environmentally friendly, and multifunctional. Thus, there is much that we as engineers can learn from nature as we develop the next generation of machines and technology. Well, I don't know if you could have a better definition of design or the teleological argument. If I'm going to be using nature, after all, we're supposed to be living in a world that came from randomness and chaos, and yet here we are talking about how wonderfully designed it is. And so this whole field's really growing, and now they're going even further, and they're deciding, well, look, we can't mimic all these things in nature, so rather than mimic it, we will just try to control it. They'll use animals and other things to do things that, that we can't create anything to do. And we'll just see about controlling it. And so they have a phrase for that too. I'm trying to find it. But here's the problem, of course. They keep calling it Mother Nature, right? We can't improve on Mother Nature. Well, who's Mother Nature? I mean, they keep trying to personify nature and give it some kind of designing capability when they miss the whole point, right? It's the God of the Bible who has come up with the best possible engineering designs, and so who's going to out-design? I like what somebody said, in spite of the deterioration of the world, the entrance of disease and mutations into the created order, even after several thousand years, scientists and engineers are admitting his designs are still better, still outperform anything men can do. I mean, let's think about it. Planes do pretty good, but a plane can't fly like a bird can. So that's a pretty easy thing to see. Autonomous biological control is what they call that other area of work. Again, just another concession that nature exhibits design, and therefore they are endorsing the design concept in nature. And I like what somebody asked the question, does it make a lot of sense to try to mimic something that you think comes from millions of random chance mutations? Is that the kind of thing you want to copy? Doesn't make much sense. So biomimicry is another area which they admit that there's design in the natural world. Now this last area is pretty funny. It's just kind of a funny thing. A lot of times in their writings, you'll see some evidence, some Freudian slips on the part of atheists, and they'll talk about, I don't know if you've ever read them, let's say they're talking, or if you're watching one of these National Geographic shows, and they'll be examining some particular animal, whatever, a salamander, and they'll say, this particular feature of this particular animal, this is an atheist talking, an evolutionist, and they'll say things like, man, it really shows some spectacular design, or this particular feature is, quote, designed to do this. And they'll use terminology like that all the time, even though they claim to be atheists or evolutionists. And so some atheists have noticed that in the writings, and they don't like it. And so they've tried to redefine the word design. One guy, in a book that he wrote back in 2008, I'm trying to find this guy's name, it's pretty funny. Kenneth Miller. He's an evolutionary biologist at Brown University. He co-authored one of the textbooks that's used in most high schools these days. And he admits that scientists routinely mention the presence of design in a lot of the things they study. And he admits that the human body shows evidence of design, which, by the way, the human body is probably the most miraculously designed thing there is. Pointing out examples like the design of the ball and socket joints of the human hips and shoulders and the S-curve of the human spine that allows us to walk upright. But he says, he published an article and he said, well, there is design. And you know what he called it? Evolutionary design. Now let's think about that. Evolution is based on random, haphazard, chaotic, chance. And he came up with this term called evolutionary design. Webster's dictionary defines an oxymoron as, quote, a combination of contradictory or incongruous words such as cruel kindness, jumbo shrimp, other such words you can think of. Well, I would say that they can add to their list in the definition of oxymoron, evolutionary design, right? I mean, we're not stupid. If there's a painting, there had to be a painter, right? There's a building, there's a builder. Engine, there's an engineer. And if there's design, there's a designer. And it's not evolutionary because there's nothing purposeful and orderly about evolution. And so that's kind of silly to talk about it designing itself. So those are just some areas in which you will read in which evolution is just, this teleological argument is just, I don't know if I'd say difficult or really impossible for them to deal with. They look around and they say, man, this universe is fine-tuned, it runs like a top. This particular feature of this animal is designed to do this. And then they get to the anthropic principle and talk about, man, you know, it just seems like that our world was made just for us, just for life to succeed here. When you talk about the balance of carbon and all that kind of stuff. And then they get down to the bottom line and they say, but it's just an accident. And that just doesn't make sense. You have to have a bias in order to think like that. Yeah, you have to have a bias.
I agree.
Yeah.
It was 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was an article in the paper, and now there's some scientists, I think it was in Britain, that decided that we probably came from rats instead of apes.
And I'm sure some of those guys did come from rats. But I didn't. Well, let's look at a few areas then. And we're not going to spend, we'll spend one other Sunday on this, because like I said, we could go on and on and on. But I would like to talk about just a few things in which this, you know, they're pretty interesting when it comes to this teleological argument. One thing that atheists like to talk about, Carl Sagan and some others did, is they say, well, this universe it just shows poor teleological design because look how big it is. And what they say is, look, why would a God create something so big and only have one little ball in it and put us on it? And you're telling me that and there's no other life, no other intelligent life in the universe. Is that what you're telling me? What a big waste of space that is. Well, first of all, that's kind of like the book of Job, right? Now that's men looking up at the Creator and saying, well, why did you make it this way? I mean, we don't understand it, and because we don't understand it, we don't like it. We don't agree with it. We don't like you because it seems to me, in all of my wisdom, God, you wasted a lot of space. Right? I mean, that's the book of Job. I don't understand it. You didn't do it the way I think you ought to. God says, you don't tell me what to do. You don't know everything. That's what he told Job. And so, the Bible's anticipated that kind of skepticism. Remember Genesis chapter 1. Yeah, he made a big universe. But he gives us some idea. Maybe not everything, but he tells us some idea of why. Now in Genesis 1, he says in verse 14, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. And he made the 2 great lights, sun, the moon, and so forth. Well, one very specific function of the stars that occupy the space far beyond our solar system is that they're They're light bearers, right? And they do a lot of things. I suspect that those mariners in the 16 and 1700s, when they were crossing the ocean, were sure glad that God made a big universe and put stars in certain places, or they'd have never made it here, right? Well, there's one reason. The other reason, of course, that God made this universe that we live in so vast is that it does what? What does it do? Yeah, what? Absolutely. Absolutely. It declares His infinitude, His existence, His glory, His eternality, His power. So that according to Romans 1:20, when we look at all these things, we are without what? Excuse. We look at this overwhelming display, and we're without excuse. And frankly, and we'll leave it here, and we'll pick up here next week, and we'll finish the teleological argument. We'll look at some interesting things. But frankly, atheism is just another form of polytheism, right? Look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, and we'll leave it there. Look at Deuteronomy 4. Deuteronomy 4. Moses, talking in verse 19, God talking, really. Moses wrote it. And take heed lest you lift your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven, you feel driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord your God has given to all the peoples under the whole heaven as a heritage. Atheists laugh at people in the jungles of South America or whatever that are worshiping wood and stone and their ancestors or whatever, and yet that's what atheists are doing. They worship the sun, the moon. Atheism is just another form of polytheism. That is, worshiping the physical world around you rather than giving glory to the one who made it. All right, we'll pick up here next week.